Hello everyone and welcome to the latest GWPF webinar on the topic of carbon taxes. Now, this is a debate that has attracted a lot of academic attention, but perhaps has not quite filtered out to the public. And indeed, we've seen in a few referendums in both Washington State, in the US, and also in Switzerland, that when it's been sort of given over to the public, the voters have rejected it. So what is this idea of carbon taxes? Now, this is what we call a Pigouvian tax. So it's the idea that emitting CO2 has a negative externality. It has a negative effect when we release it. And therefore, we tax that externality at its marginal cost. And then we allow the market to discover those opportunities to reduce emissions that are lower in price than the carbon price. So it gives us access to a whole range of new information that a government planner wouldn't have access to. But when it's confronted with the real world, we have, of course, many government interventions in a number of different ways. And we have subsidies for green technologies, for example, and these work perhaps in different directions towards the carbon tax. So it's not as simple as the ideal scenario might suggest. And today we're going to be working through those issues and shedding a variety of perspectives on them. Now, the political context at the present moment, I'm sure many of you will be aware of. We've just had the election of Joe Biden in the United States, and we can expect many more policies supporting various forms of climate action in the years ahead. In the UK, we've got a government who's proposing something like a green industrial revolution. And for those of us with a more free market bent, we might be quite skeptical as to the idea of a government creating an industrial revolution by picking winners. So carbon taxes are really posed as an alternative towards the government picking winners, but instead allowing the market to decide where emissions reductions happen. And we've got a fantastic panel joining us today. Now, just a moment of housekeeping before we begin. You will see at the bottom of your screens there should be a question and answer panel. Please submit any questions you may have to the question and answer panel. Now, there's also a chat panel, so feel free to discuss any issues that you would like to on there. But those, I won't be looking at those to put questions to our panelists. I will be looking at the question and answer panel. So if you want your question answers answered, please do go on the question and answer panel, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion later. So without further ado, just to say welcome to everyone. We've got people coming in from around the world. We're very grateful for them to join us. And if there's been one benefit of the pandemic, for us, it's been being able to have these events online has meant we've reached a much broader audience around the world. And it's so important to make sure these discussions are international, and indeed, particularly in relation to carbon taxes, we see that if you have higher carbon taxes in some jurisdictions, it can create complications, to say the least, if carbon is taxed at a lower rate elsewhere. So our first speaker this evening is Professor Richard Toll. He's a professor of economics at the University of Sussex here in the UK, and also a professor of the economics of climate change at the Free University of Amsterdam. Now, he's been involved in this field for a very long time. He's been a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th assessment report. So he's been at the heart of the economic discussions around climate change, and he's been defined at various points as a lukewarmer. So I think the context of that, just by saying that perhaps the carbon tax shouldn't be impossibly high, or that if impacts of climate change might be positive up to a certain level and then go negative in the future, he's therefore attracted the ire of some more radical climate activists who have suggested that this is a form of heresy, to suggest that it's not all doom and gloom. And we're very grateful for his academic integrity of approaching these issues from a very rational mindset. And he's here joining us today, and so I will pass over to Richard, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Harry. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in Silico. I forgot to click this button. I took my charge literally, and I'm going to talk about the impact of carbon taxes. I'm not going to talk about, but we can do that during the discussion, about how high the carbon tax should be. But I'm just going to look at how effective have these things been in the past. If you open a textbook of economics or environmental economics, then what you would find is that carbon taxes are a superior or the superior policy instrument to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you can sum that up by saying that carbon dioxide emission reduction is best done by a carbon tax, a uniform carbon tax, and nothing but a carbon tax. And that follows from the work, now quite old already, of Tinbergen, of Bohnmol, and Weitzman. And the theory here is quite clear. Carbon taxes work. And there's also tons and tons of ex-ante policy evaluations where essentially you wonder, what will this policy do? What would a carbon tax do if we impose it, using a whole range of models? And these models show, yeah, carbon taxes work. But that is not the question I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about, do these things actually work in practice? What you're looking at here is a map of the world, obviously, from the World Bank carbon pricing dashboard. And there's three colors on the map, four colors on the map. White is the ocean. Gray are those countries where there is no carbon price. In blue, you're looking at those countries where there is a carbon price that comes through a carbon tax. And in green, you're looking at those areas of the world where there is a system of tradable permits for CO2 and sometimes other greenhouse gases as well. That is for the countries. And then the dots denote parts of countries, provinces, states, cities, those sort of things. And at the moment, if the World Bank data is correct, there are 22 countries with a carbon tax. 4 provinces in Canada have a carbon tax, 2 states in Mexico, and 1 city in the USA. That is not good enough, of course. That is today's situation. If you want to see where the carbon taxes work, you actually need to look at a little bit of history. If you go back 10 years in time, then only 8 countries in 1 province had a carbon tax. And the question I'm going to ask is, what did we learn from this experience? Well, the first lesson that we learned from this is that even though carbon taxes have been around for a while, and actually Scandinavian countries, Finland was first introducing a carbon tax in 1990, shortly followed by Poland a few months later. Even though we have had 30 years of actual climate policy, there have been very little independent academic studies showing what was the effect of all this. And the same is true for these carbon taxes. Perhaps the first study was by Bo-Chang Lin and a colleague, where they looked at 18 European countries to study in total, 5 of which had a carbon tax introduced. And what they find is that only in Finland did the carbon tax significantly reduce the growth rate of CO2. And in the other 4 countries, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, they actually could not detect an effect on CO2 emissions. And they claim that this is because, as Harry said in the beginning, you can also use climate policy not to reduce greenhouse gases, but as we often see, you can use climate policy to pick winners. Or rather, in this case, they picked not losers. These carbon taxes that were introduced in these countries that you see here, Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark, had so many exemptions to the carbon tax that essentially they did not sort any statistically detectable effect. Hadjek et al. Looked at a very similar situation, focused on 5 European countries, slightly different time period, and they do actually find a significant effect, but one that is barely significant. At a 95% level, they do find that the carbon tax reduces industrial emissions, not total emissions, by 12 kilogram per capita for every euro of tax raised, that is euro per ton of CO2. Theoretically or methodologically, probably the best study is by Anderson, published last year in the American Economic Journal, where he looked at 25 countries in the OECD, so this now also includes Canada and the US and Japan, and using a fairly fancy method, he found that the carbon tax in Sweden did reduce transport emissions by 11%. Interestingly, he also found, and that corresponds with a lot of additional earlier evidence, that consumers respond much more strongly to taxes than they do to prices. And the explanation is probably that, definitely if you're talking about the oil market or the gasoline market, then prices go up and down, and people sort of swallow the price increase and do not respond to that by buying a more efficient engine, for instance, a more fuel efficient car, whereas taxes people typically see as they can only go up, and therefore people anticipate that the tax will be there to stay and therefore change their behavior by buying a more fuel efficient car or cycling to work or whatever works for them. Now, these 3 studies are all the studies that there are for the rest of the world. And then there's 7 studies. Yes, that's 7 studies for British Columbia, which was one of the first places to introduce a carbon tax. And these studies, and I won't take you through all of them, all find that yes, this had an effect on emissions. They all find that this particular policy was effective in reducing emissions, particularly gasoline, because that's what the tax was focused. The one exception to that is the Hildebrand and Arutku study, where they actually show that it was only an initial drop in gasoline demand, but after the first 5 years or so, essentially British Columbia reverted back to trends. The Yamazaki study stands out among this crop of papers because they did not look at the effect on emissions, but they looked at the effect of employment. And that is, of course, a concern that a lot of people have. If you increase the price of energy, then jobs will get lost, the economic growth will slow down. But they actually find, yes, there is a shift in employment from energy intensive to less energy intensive industries. They actually found that the overall effect was a rise in employment rather than a drop in employment. I'm speaking mostly to a UK audience. So what is happening in our country? Actually, there's been no exposure evaluation of the introduction of the carbon tax a couple of years ago. But there is one ex-ante study that is, I think, particularly relevant that was published 12 years ago now in the Journal of Regulatory Economics. And they showed that the UK carbon tax has been very costly and has not had any effect on emissions. And that is because the UK carbon tax is levied on emissions that are already regulated under the EU emission trading system. So even though the UK carbon tax reduced emissions in the UK, because the EU ETS cap is Europe-wide, and that has not been affected by the introduction of the carbon tax in the UK, essentially for every ton of CO2 avoided in the UK, a ton of CO2 is emitted elsewhere in Europe. At the same time, of course, this carbon tax did impose real costs on real companies and real people. So at the margin, the cost is infinitely high, right? You do pay money, but you get nothing in return. But there's been no exposed evaluations of how true this really is. So to sum up, the evidence on the effectiveness of carbon taxes is pretty thin. There's two handfuls of papers, and 70% of them are about British Columbia. But the evidence that we have does not contradict the fact or the theoretical prediction that carbon taxes are effective. And the only thing that you need to assume there really is that the demand curve slopes downwards, which of course we know in general. There's also plenty of evidence for that about energy demand. And of course, there's also a range of studies that look at the impact of tradable permits that also find that, yes, these things do reduce CO2 emissions, perhaps not as much as some people would like us to believe, and perhaps not at the same cost as some people would like us to believe, but they do seem to sort an effect. Now, I talked about the ex-ante studies and about the ex-post studies. Ex-ante studies will also give you an estimate of the economic impact of levying a carbon tax. There have been, to the best of my knowledge, no ex-post evaluations of this. Nobody has tried to estimate the actual economic cost of imposing a carbon tax. So there we are really in the dark and we don't know what is going on. What is the case, of course, is that we do know the countries that did introduce the carbon tax, Sweden, British Columbia, those sort of places, they are not economic wastelands. So the people who predict that a carbon tax will ruin the economy, I think can rest easily, or people who worry about that can rest easily that that is not what is going to happen. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think because we want to make good progress and get onto our group discussion later, we'll move on straight to the next speaker. But just before we do, just a shout out to all our viewers on YouTube. I mentioned earlier about the Q&A panel. Of course, you don't have that on YouTube, but there is a comments feature on there. So please do feed in your questions to us on YouTube as well, and I'll be having a look at those over the course of the webinar. So I'll just say a few words now about our next speaker, Victoria Hewson. She is the Head of Regulatory Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a wonderful think tank based just around the corner from us here at 55 Tufton Street, who do so much really excellent work in exploring the benefits of free markets and what they can achieve from a policy perspective in terms of expanding wealth throughout both Britain and the world, and indeed improving education around economic issues, which is unfortunately quite lacking in this country. But the IEA is doing great work to push back on some of the misconceptions that people have. And she's also practiced as a lawyer in the past and worked for Procter & Gamble in the UK and in Germany. So she's got real world experience of both trade and regulations from a theoretical policy perspective, but also from a pragmatic business perspective as well. So she's going to be taking us through some of the trade and regulation aspects with us now. So Victoria, over to you.
Thanks, Harry. I'm just going to pop my slides up as well. Yeah, so as Harry says, I'm head of the Regulatory Affairs Programme at the IAA, and in that programme we look at the regulatory state, its powers, the accountability of regulators, and whether they actually achieve their objectives. I also work on trade policy, so I'm going to focus on the two relevant aspects of I'm going to focus on those two aspects of some of the proposals for a carbon tax, and just discussing the effectiveness or otherwise of a carbon tax, not by reference to whether it will in fact help to reverse or mitigate climate change and save the planet, but by reference to other features that proponents of economy-wide carbon taxes often put forward as benefits. Firstly, simplification of the myriad taxes, reliefs, regulations, etc., that currently sort of litter the environmental, regulatory and fiscal scene. Proponents of a carbon tax would argue that if you have a properly constructed carbon tax, you don't need all of those additional, or you don't need many of those additional regulations and taxes, because you can unleash the desired behaviours through market forces. And then secondly, the idea of levelling the playing field in international trade terms with border taxes or border adjustments to disincentivise importing carbon intensive goods from lower standard jurisdictions. So we have here, I've put up a quote by Dieter Helm in his quite influential cost of energy review, where he noted that the sheer number of regulatory interventions and tax interventions in the UK energy market is so great that few market participants, few regulators, ministers or civil servants can grasp them all, and that this complexity of all of these overlapping interventions actually is in itself likely to increase the cost of energy. And I would add to that they also, in addition to making energy prices more expensive for consumers and representing significant cost to businesses affecting competitiveness, but they also make it really hard to measure how effective any particular measure is. And I think, Richard has just talked a bit about how little ex post evaluation is done on any of these measures, and potentially the sheer scale and number of overlapping measures makes that quite difficult. So we can see from this representation of what the regulatory landscape might look like before and after implementation of a carbon tax as envisaged by the authors of a policy exchange paper proposing it. They envisaged that there really could be quite a big cleanup of various overlapping taxes, levies and regulations. The after box there is considerably less populous than the before. However, it's notable that even here, Policy Exchange is another pro-free market think tank. Even here, they do foresee that quite a number of regulations, like vehicle standards, building and design regulations, should be retained. And I guess inevitably, research funding and subsidies still feature. From a narrow deregulatory perspective, this looks quite positive, but it also suggests that maybe these proponents of carbon taxes aren't so confident in the free market power of a carbon tax, because they still envisage lots of quite specific interventions to guide behaviours as well. And also, I would say I'm cynical enough to doubt if this is what would happen in practice. No doubt my rounds of special pleading and lobbying, not least by regulators themselves, would find more and more reasons for retaining lots of these layers. In fact, the UK government is consulting at present about replacing our participation in the EU emissions trading scheme with a carbon tax. I'm open to being corrected on this, but I don't think I've seen any associated proposed rollback of regulations so far. And in fact, the proposal by the government seems quite unambitious. However, in addition to this, the policy exchange proposal and lots of other similar proposals include a border adjustment tax. And I'm going to now talk a bit about how actually I think the administrative burden associated with that has been somewhat understated. So a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or a carbon border tax, is in many ways quite a logical, neat sounding part of a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme for that matter. Without it, domestic carbon pricing doesn't capture imports or freight, which represent quite a material proportion of carbon consumption. So we end up misstating our emissions reductions, which again, Richard has just given one example of that. And obviously, it also incentivizes foreign production and procurement of goods at the expense of domestic manufacturers, notwithstanding the attempts to compensate them to avoid this so-called carbon leakage. The European Commission Green Deal that was published earlier this year, their proposals include a border adjustment mechanism. And although it's not clear what form it will take, whether it will be a border tax or some kind of extension of the emissions trading scheme to foreign producers in some way, it's clear from the quotes that I've put up on this slide from Ursula von der Leyen that there is actually quite a strongly protectionist overtone to this move. Now, clearly, devising and operating such a system will bring administration costs and complexity in and of itself. Aside from the pure economic aspect of it, measuring the carbon intensity of producers around the world and assessing if they have been equivalently taxed to EU producers, perhaps by entering into agreements with other countries to do so in a new kind of trade agreement, or potentially placing the burden on the exporters and imports themselves. All of this is still quite obscure in the EU's proposals, but I think we can say it's not going to be straightforward. What does seem clear, though, from the image that I've put up here from the Boston Consulting Group, is that a border tax would have very significant impacts on competition and international trade. There is a reason that the border tax would be necessary, and that is that buying carbon-intensive goods from outside the EU and the UK, or similarly taxed jurisdictions, is economically attractive. The knock-on effect, if you change that, would be quite material, as we can see here, not just on goods that are directly affected by a carbon tax, but throughout the entire value chain, affecting the profitability of import-reliant producers in the EU, and ultimately raising prices for consumers on everything from textiles to computers, who all rely on imported products that have some degree of carbon intensity. And as we can see, there are some obvious ones: mining products, coke and petroleum, but chemicals, pharmaceuticals, all of these products, all of these goods incorporate goods that will be affected by a carbon border tax. And of course, all of this is to say nothing of the effect of on the development of emerging countries that have sought to leverage their competitive advantage in these kinds of products. And it's not just a case that producers will either absorb the tax or pass it on. In fact, some export suppliers and some importers will simply exit the market, allowing domestic producers to raise their prices, especially where demand is not very elastic. So it's a fairly dynamic situation that the EU could be unleashing here. And I'm not sure either. There are also sometimes proposals that carbon tax could be made progressive and redistributive by redistributing revenues in the form of some kind of carbon dividend. I'm not sure whether that would suffice to offset these wider economic impacts, even if one can believe that it's remotely likely that governments would relinquish any of those tax revenues. So far from it being a free market solution, certainly the border tax aspects seem more likely to serve protectionist ends and producer interests. And actually, there's a big question about whether it's even permissible under WTO rules. Already countries like Russia, whose producers would be disadvantaged as against countries like Saudi Arabia due to the nature of their production processes and how they actually exploit their natural resources. And that really shows that there's a very strong geopolitical aspect to this as well, as countries like Russia, as I say, are saying that they would challenge any EU border tax in the WTO. We can perhaps discuss this a bit more in the questions, but I would say broadly, with lots of lawyerish caveats, you can probably craft a WTO compliant carbon border tax, but it has to be non-discriminatory and not just disguised protectionism. So to conclude, I would say it's possible to see a border tax as a deregulatory measure, but especially border adjustment mechanisms really worry me, as they seem less like leveling the playing field and actually more like a race to the bottom on growth and prosperity.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And we look forward to hearing you from again in a few moments. But first, our next panelist today is Professor Ross McKittrick, and he's a professor of economics at the University of Guelph in Canada. And he's been a good friend to the GWPF for many years. He is currently one of our academic advisors on the Academic Advisory Council, and he has indeed published a GWPF paper on an evidence-based approach to pricing CO2 emissions, which if you haven't read it, I can show you a copy here, and that's definitely one worth reading for some follow-up reading after this evening's discussion if you want to delve a bit more into the topic. He's also a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute. He was instrumental in exposing some of the statistical shenanigans around the Michael Mann's hockey stick graph, and I'm sure many of you will have followed that affair with interest. And he's testified before the US Congress and also the House of Commons in Canada. So Professor Ross McKittrick, over to you.
Thanks, Harry. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I don't have slides. I don't have any slides prepared. I do have a notepad with notes on it, though. I can hold them up if you'd like to see them. But what I want to do is go to the question of carbon taxes. Are they effective? And the question that comes to me is, are effective for what? And a point that I'll repeat on a little bit is, when you talk about carbon taxes from an economic point of view, quantity is not the target, price is the target. So the policy isn't implemented with a specific point on the quantity axis in view. if the idea of the policy is you think people should pay $20 a ton to cover the social cost of the carbon dioxide emissions, and you charge them a tax of $20 a ton, then the policy is effective by definition. Now, if you want to charge them $20 a ton and have their emissions go down by 50%, it's not going to be effective for that because those are incompatible goals. But at the same time, there's no policy that will get you that combination of outcomes of only paying $20 a ton and getting your emissions down by half. So we could say our carbon tax is effective for minimizing the cost of abatement policy. And yes, there the economic theory is fairly clear. As long as the revenue from the carbon tax is captured by the government and used to reduce other tax rates. So if you have full revenue recycling, and in particular, you don't want to be taking the revenue and using it for green subsidies or for other policies that end up messing up the price signals. And also, a really key condition is that the tax needs to be implemented on its own. And so Victoria alluded to discussions on this point, which is that we're in a world now where there are tons of carbon policies in place. And unfortunately, even here in Canada, where we had British Columbia introduced a carbon tax and they had revenue recycling, they used the money to reduce income taxes. But then they went ahead and started implementing lots of other green policies, building restrictions, a low carbon fuel standard, the usual list, renewable energy requirements for the electricity sector. All of those side policies mean we can no longer guarantee that a carbon price is effective at minimizing the cost of achieving the policy target. That outcome only happens in theory if it's the only policy. If you have the carbon price coupled with regulation, all bets are off. It may just make everything worse, in fact. Then we could ask, so is a carbon tax effective for achieving the optimal outcome? And there again, yes, theory says if you have an estimate that you're happy with of the marginal damages associated with fuel consumption in this case, then yes, you can get to the optimal outcome. However, there's a somewhat lesser known principle here, which was originally worked out by the economist Agnar Sandmo in the 1970s, and then it's been recapitulated since then, which is that you need to scale the tax in each jurisdiction by a measure of the burdensomeness of the tax system, a number called the marginal cost of public funds. And if you have a very inefficient tax system, you have a high marginal cost of public funds. And essentially the optimal emissions price should be deflated by the marginal cost of public funds. And this is a point that doesn't really get into the discussion very much, even in professional circles, because among other things, it implies that the optimal emission price should not be constant across all countries because every country has a different tax system. And some jurisdictions, especially developing countries, may have extremely high marginal cost of public funds. So they should, as a result, have lower emission prices without penalizing them for that. Another point, are carbon taxes effective for reducing emissions? And this goes to the material that Richard was looking at. And the issue here is really how elastic is the demand for emissions, which you can think of as how elastic is the demand for fossil fuels. And the answer is it's one of the more inelastic demands out there in the economy, which is why taxes are already fairly high on fuels, because it's an appropriate target for taxation because it has a low elasticity of demand. And here again, you have to remember quantity is not the target of an emissions pricing rule. And we get into this debate about were they really effective or not, because you put a tax on CO2 emissions related to motor vehicle fuel, and then you go back and check a few years later and maybe it went down a little bit, but it didn't go down a whole lot. Well, that simply means the demand curve is fairly steep. And so any policy that you implemented to try to reduce emissions is going to have very high marginal costs. At least the carbon tax will achieve your emissions at the lowest possible cost if you're implementing it in a fairly efficient way. Now, with the British Columbia case, I should comment, the numbers there are they vary quite a bit. It's a hard one to measure because most of British Columbia is clustered in the Greater Vancouver Regional District, which is right on the border with Washington State. And there's a lot of cross-border traffic, and a lot of people fill up their cars in the United States. It's for neighborhoods in the GVRD, a gas station across the border may not be any farther away than gas stations in another part of the city. So that makes it a little bit difficult to figure out the effects of the carbon tax in British Columbia on motor vehicle sales or fuel sales in British Columbia. Is a carbon tax effective at dealing with market uncertainty? So this is an issue that economists have been interested in. And here, without going into the details, what I would say is it's a much better instrument than cap and trade. And if you can picture demand and supply diagrams in your mind, you have a very inelastic demand curve. And if you have a cap and trade system, you have a vertical supply curve. So you have two extremely steep lines and you're looking for the intersection point, and then they shuffle around a little bit with economic fluctuations. And what it means is all the volatility is on the price axis. And regulators and politicians don't like that. And so it puts a real strain on using cap and trade for controlling CO2 emissions. There are other types of pollutants where cap and trade works much better because you don't have such a steep demand curve for permits. But carbon taxes are better at managing the volatility, especially the volatility associated with economic fluctuations and price fluctuations. It gives you price certainty. And for that reason, a lot of environmentalists don't actually like carbon taxes because you can't guarantee the quantity outcome. So when a long time ago, when the United States was considering climate policies, the era of the McCain-Lieberman proposals and so forth, a lot of economists wanted safety valve pricing built in, which means if the permit price hits a certain ceiling, the government just switches to issuing as many permits as you want at the backstop price. Well, that would effectively convert it into a carbon tax. And environmental groups oppose that for the very reason that they knew you're inevitably going to hit that backstop price pretty quickly. And then you don't have a firm guarantee on the quantity. But if you want a firm guarantee on the quantity, it means you have to be prepared to live with a huge amount of uncertainty on the price, including occasional explosive surprises to the upside. Is a carbon tax effective at achieving transparency regarding costs? And this one, I would say, yes, it is, because people hear the announcement that a carbon tax is going to come in. They see the price go up. Here in Canada, the carbon tax on our heating bills is actually a separate line item. So people see the carbon tax. It's a very visible policy, which is probably why they're unpopular. I think other climate policies tend to get buried into regulations, so people are paying it, but they don't necessarily realize what the cost is. And if they did realize it, then they'd be unpopular too. Carbon taxes are unpopular because I think in general, people's willingness to pay for CO2 emissions is still pretty limited. And so regulators might prefer the idea of a hidden policy that's buried in the cost of production. But when the public sees the policy, they are popular. The exception in British Columbia, when the carbon tax was brought in, it was made clear to people that all the money that's collected is going to go into a separate fund, and that fund will be used to reduce your income taxes next year. And the income tax rate went down. And so people were willing to accept that as a trade-off. Now, that was a setup in the beginning. There's evidence since then, well, the province has clearly deviated from that. They no longer refund all the revenue into income tax reductions. They're using it for lots of other spending and tax credit purposes. And so they've diluted the revenue recycling aspect of it. But I think if you can be upfront with people and explain how the revenue is going to be used, then that helps with the popularity. And then finally, my final point, are they effective at stopping climate change? Well, The best you could say is they're effective at reducing CO2 emissions somewhat below what they otherwise would have been. But if we look at the policy mechanisms that are out there for reducing the global CO2 level on a large scale over the next 100 years, we already know from the studies that were done that even full compliance with Kyoto and full compliance with Paris would hardly make any difference over the next century in terms of the level of CO2 in the atmosphere that we reach with those policies. So any one jurisdiction implementing a carbon tax, they shouldn't do it on the expectation that they're going to radically change the quantity of CO2 at the global level. And therefore, they're not going to radically have any effect on the climate. Again, I go back to the beginning point. The carbon taxes, you have to understand that price is the target, not quantity. And that makes sense in an economic context. So you figure out what you think people should pay for their emitting activity. You charge them that through a tax. It's effective by definition. It may, however, not be effective at all these secondary goals that people sometimes tack on. It's not clear, though, that any other policy would be better at achieving those goals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ross. And so the first question I'd like to pose to each of you is one about the social cost of carbon. Of course, I've been watching along at some of the questions coming in on the question and answer session panel and in the chat, and a strong feeling that's coming through is people are questioning actually are emissions of CO2 that much? Do they have a negative externality? And so I'd like to get your opinions on that and combine that with a political question, which is that given that we know the sort of overwhelming burden of climate regulation is adding costs onto the economy, is a sort of academic debate on the centre right around carbon taxes sort of drawing us into a sort of rabbit hole, whereas the discussion is increasingly moving off the turf of, well, how do we make businesses more competitive? How do we reduce regulatory burdens for industry and business, and sort of using up bandwidth on what is a sort of rather protectionist perhaps, and also sort of hyper-regulatory sort of movement that we should be resisting more strongly. Ross, do you want to come in on that first?
Okay, well, on the question of what is the social cost of carbon, well, Richard, as many of you know, is a pioneer in this field of developing the class of models that are used for calculating the social cost of carbon, integrated assessment models. An integrated assessment model is really a giant if-then statement. It says if all these premises hold true, then the marginal social damages from releasing a ton of CO2 are as follows, and the trajectory will change into the future. Some of the big ifs, if you have to decide on a discount rate, because many of the damages in a system as slow moving as the global climate don't appear for 100 or 200 years down the road. Another big if is the climate sensitivity parameter. So this kind of compresses all these enormous uncertainties into a single number, but the single number is what is the impact on global average surface temperatures around the world if you double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and then you allow the climate system to come to something like an equilibrium in the future with the oceans and the atmosphere. And another big if is, are there nonlinearities, tipping points, discontinuities that could cause rapid unanticipated changes? So I have done a couple of studies with co-authors where we've looked not at so much at the discounting issue, but at the climate sensitivity parameter. And the standard number that's used in a lot of integrated assessment modeling work is 3 degrees. And you don't have to go very far below 3 degrees to have a large reduction in the estimated social cost of carbon, even at 3 degrees. I should say that the social cost of carbon numbers that typically come out of integrated assessment models are way lower than the marginal cost of most of the policies that we're seeing in Canada. Our government's imposing a clean fuel standard where even they admit the marginal costs are $200 to $300 a ton. And that's much higher than mainstream estimates of the social cost of carbon. I would say, based on a paper that I published earlier this year, if you use what are called the empirically constrained estimates of climate sensitivity, which is a branch of the literature in climatology, and you take account of some of the updated evidence of CO2 fertilization, then you're going to get a pretty low estimate of the social cost of carbon, and the discount rate in that case doesn't really matter because the numbers are so low enough that there's really no difference between imposing it or not imposing it on the CO2 trajectory. If you want a very high social cost of carbon, you need to use a high climate sensitivity and then also build in some of these speculative tipping points so that you get massive Earth scale disasters taking place and that give you costs off the charts, and then also use a very low discount rate. So if it happens 200 years from now, you assign a very high cost to the present value. So my own view of that, and then the discussion paper that you mentioned at the beginning, Harry, there my proposal for getting around this enormous and I think intractable question about how to set the social cost of carbon is to use real-time temperature measures and tie the tax rate to an objective measure of an atmospheric temperature index, and then couple that with a futures market. So then the market itself would have to place its bets on where they think the tax is going to go in the future, and everyone will get their preferred outcome. So if you think that there isn't going to be much warming, then the tax rate starts low and it stays low. If you think there's a lot of warming coming, it might start low, but over the next couple of decades, it will rise rapidly. And so a system like that, in my view, should make everybody happy because everybody will think that they're going to get their preferred policy trajectory.
Okay, thank you, Ross. I'm just going to bring in Victoria next. She has to leave us at 6 p.m. So I'll go to her next and we can hear what she has to say on this issue.
I'll just briefly touch on the political question, which I think is an important one, especially at the moment where there's talk of the Prime Minister and the government resetting to be embracing even more a sort of green agenda and becoming even more wet, as we used to call it, economically and socially. And I think it's an interesting point because free market proponents have sort of we've said, okay, yes, climate change is happening and we all really care about the environment. That's a given. And embracing a carbon tax is seen as allowing free market people to put forward better policy proposals in order to pursue those green policy aims in a better, more market friendly, less economically damaging way. And for reasons that we've all discussed, that has lots of persuasive aspects to it. But I'm sorry, in this country at present, when we have just a few weeks ago, the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities and Local Government, Robert Jenrick, rejected a planning application for an open cast mining site in Northumberland, where I'm from. And this is, it's an open cast mining, it's clean, it's an efficient way of extracting coal. And even though we've closed all the coal-fired power stations, there is still demand for coal in this country. We import a lot of coal still. And this would have been a local source that would have given a source of proper engineering in a part of the country that really needs it, where jobs mainly tend to be sourced these days from tourism and public sector work. And the local planning authority accepted the proposal and it was going to go ahead. And the Secretary of State has now overturned it, presumably because it doesn't fit with the green agenda. But that's just so illogical, and it really infuriates me because it's basically saying, no, we can only import coal. We can't produce our own coal, even though there's a need for it. And even though it would be an important source of employment, you know, in an area of the world where we're supposed to be trying to level up from. And that just really depresses me, because it feels like this, for the government at present, it's an evidence-free zone. They're more concerned about pushing certain figures around emissions, and you know, producing our own coal would somehow be seen as a betrayal of that agenda. And so I do think, possibly, Harry, that you're right, and this you know, the idea of an efficient flat tax to deregulate and improve competitiveness is nice, but I see so many reasons why the driving forces within government would prevent that from happening, and they would still continue to make terrible decisions on planning and regulation, because there's so little evidence-based decision making going on.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. I expect, Richard, maybe you have a slightly different perspective on that. Would you like to come in next?
I would like to say two things about the social cost of carbon. It's obviously an important number, and actually there have been many estimates published of this. My last count, which was actually in March, had 1,348 estimates of the social cost of carbon, and they range somewhere between -20 and plus 140,000. And Ross explained some of the reasons why these estimates differ. But there's obviously an enormous range there, which means that anybody who will go around and tell you this is the optimal climate policy is either a fool or a liar. That said, even though there is this enormous range, there are estimates that are more credible and estimates that are less credible. And I would argue that estimates that fall below $10 per ton of C or fall above 100, maybe 200 tons of C are just, people have just cooked the books essentially. But that still leaves an order of magnitude as to where you would put your policy, where would be the optimal policy. So I think the social cost of carbon, we can't pin it down, but I think it can still be useful in policy. And the first use it has is that you can ask the question, well, if we impose this particular social cost of carbon as a carbon tax, where do we end up with our emissions? And where do we end up with climate change? And the answer to that question is, regardless of whether you impose a $10 carbon tax or a $100 carbon tax, is nowhere near Paris. And that is one thing that consistently comes out of the type of cost-benefit analyses that Will Nordhaus pioneered and won him the Nobel Prize, is that our targets for climate policy and for emission reduction are simply not the optimal targets. They are way too ambitious. And the second use of social cost of carbon, or finding some sort of compromise in governments about what the social cost of carbon would be, is to counter the things that Victoria talked about. If a government agrees on a particular carbon price, it doesn't really matter what that carbon price is, then that would expose those policies that are way too costly. And unfortunately, we have a great many of those where the benefits are small and the costs are large. And it would expose those policies as perhaps something that we should not pursue, or if we have already implemented, perhaps we should I should not read the chat at the same time, or that perhaps we should abandon. And that is, I think, another important reason to agree at least on a number that is reasonable, so that we can evaluate policies and say, well, this idea is smarter than that idea, and that is unfortunately something that the governments, our dear leaders, don't always do.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just say goodbye to Victoria now, and a big thank you from us at the GWPF for joining us and giving us your thoughts there on carbon taxes.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So I think that discussion leads us on quite neatly to the next one, which is actually a sort of which industries will look particularly vulnerable here, and how do we protect those industries which actually perhaps can't decarbonize and don't have the technologies to decarbonize at the present moment. I'm thinking steel and cement, for example, and many other industries which are very carbon intensive and therefore and are perhaps very competitive international commodities as well. So markets can quite easily move to countries with more lax regulatory regimes. So I wonder if you could both give us your thoughts on what sort of protections can be built into this framework that would actually stop this from really penalizing industries that can't do very much about their emissions, but are nonetheless vitally important industries to our sort of modern industrial way of life. Ross.
Well, it's interesting to raise that question, because then it kind of illustrates the conundrum of climate policy in general, which is we are talking about trying to scale back economic activity that is immensely valuable to society. If you say, well, we'd like to put a price on CO2 emissions, we want to get emissions down, but there are certain industries that are singularly responsible for a lot of CO2 emissions, and boy, we don't want to lose them. That's another way of saying we're aiming at the wrong target. If the point is the value of reducing the CO2 emissions is not high enough that you're willing to sacrifice the industries that are responsible for the CO2 emissions, then don't sacrifice those industries. What you can do, you can put in various measures to mitigate the cost of a CO2 tax or a carbon tax. So we did this in Canada, for instance, with what's called the output-based pricing system, which is the mechanism for implementing a carbon pricing regime. And there were sectors that are energy intensive and trade exposed. And so they were given, first of all, you can give them exemptions on a big portion of their emissions. So they're only paying the tax on the last quarter or third of their emissions. It still has the same abatement incentive effect, but in effect, they have a smaller tax bill. But then you don't raise much revenue, so you don't have the revenue available for offsetting other tax rates. And so you increase the macro cost. That essentially becomes equivalent to imposing a tax on the rest of the economy and giving a subsidy to the firms that are impacted by the carbon tax. Alternatively, what has happened in some sectors here is just an exemption altogether or a lower tax rate. So again, you cushion the blow on the sectors that you want to shield from the policy, but then you have a less effective policy. So the short answer to your question is, if there are certain sectors like steel manufacture or whatever that you are concerned about, they're energy intensive, they're trade exposed, you don't want to lose them, you can protect them, but you can't protect them and keep the logic of the carbon tax intact in the process. And if the desire to protect them is that strong, it's really a signal that says, okay, maybe you're aiming at the wrong target on your overall emission reductions if the economic activity is more valuable to you than the emission reductions.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I would disagree with both Ross and Sarah on this. if the concern is international competitiveness, if you impose a domestic carbon tax, then the answer is a border tax adjustment, right? That immediately shields the industry from international competition in a way that is appropriate. The other question is, would you want to impose a carbon tax on energy-intensive industry that has no immediate alternatives? And I think there you should really see this as a dynamic question rather than a static question. Obviously, if they have no alternatives to reduce their emissions, then a carbon tax just imposes a deadweight loss on them, right? They're just going to lose efficiency. But that is only one of the effects of a carbon tax. At the same time, you develop an incentive to start developing those technologies, to actually start reducing their emissions, because it would be profitable to do so. And the signal that you send by imposing a carbon tax on them is, in the long run, the better and the preferred signal than the signal that you would send by exempting these industries from a carbon tax, because then essentially you tell them, look, you guys, lobbying is more effective than R&D. If you want to avoid paying the carbon tax, then you should lobby rather than invest in the sort of technologies that in the long run would reduce emissions. And Harry, you started by saying, well, we don't really have alternatives to using fossil fuel in the steel industry, and we don't really have alternatives for cement production. But that is, of course, not entirely true. Those technologies are there. They're not competitive. Most of them are far from competitive still. But one of the things that we recently saw, and again, I want to disagree with the speaker who unfortunately has left. Yes, those open air coal mines that we're talking about is metallurgical coal, right? The coal that you would use in the steel industry to get a really high quality steel. But by now you can also do that technically with concentrated solar power. Perhaps not in Northumbria, but definitely in other places of the world, the sun is strong enough that we can now raise the temperature of concentrated solar power high enough that you can indeed produce this high quality steel. So those technologies exist. They may not be competitive at the moment, but if you signal now that these industries are exempted from climate policy in the year 2020 because they lobbied hard enough, and essentially the signal is that they will be always exempted, and that is not the signal I would want to send.
Thank you. Well, we have a quite pointed question next from Professor Richard Linzen, who also happens to be one of our members of the AAC Council of the GWPF. And he asks, what are the benefits of carbon taxes on their own terms? I think we've been doing a lot of discussing about benefits as opposed to other perhaps more inefficient strategies, but actually just looking at carbon taxes on their own, what benefits can they bring? And it comes to mind your paper, Ross, about maybe making it revenue neutral, or using it to using the revenues from carbon taxes to actually offset other taxes and lower other taxes in a way that sort of the macroeconomic negative impacts of carbon taxes can be removed, and there actually be a net benefit. And I also think back to your talk, Richard, where you said you made the suggestion from this study that there had actually been a positive economic effect from the carbon tax, albeit modest. So I'd be intrigued to find out where you think that came from. Ross, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so you could think of a carbon tax just as any other tax. It's a fuel tax of very like the other fuel taxes. And so it's certainly conceivable that in an economy, you can have a tax shift that has a macroeconomic benefit. And especially in computable general equilibrium models, if you reduce taxes on incomes and factors and corporations and you shift the tax burden over to consumption, you will typically get a macroeconomic benefit from doing that. So a carbon tax, depending on the pre-existing tax system, and just leaving aside all the CO2 and climate issues, it could be the case that a set of fuel taxes in the form of a carbon tax could be part of a tax reform package that makes the economy better off. In fact, it's likely you could find those kinds of benefits for most economies. In the economics literature, we don't tend to try to make the case for carbon taxes on those grounds, because then that assumes that you have an inefficient tax system that you ought to reform, and then that's kind of a separate issue, that you really ought to reform your tax system if it's inherently inefficient. But yes, in principle, regardless of the emission reduction value, a carbon tax could be part of welfare improving tax reform.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, two things. Ross is right that a carbon tax reform could be beneficial for the economy. What these model studies that Ross referred to also show is that this is no given, and that you actually need fairly smart and fairly disciplined politicians to bring this about. So it's not something that I would, for instance, recommend to our current government in the UK, where both discipline and intelligence are in short supply. The other thing is a response to what you said, Harry. What they found in British Columbia was not a 0.7% increase in employment, but a 0.7 percentage points increase in employment. So that is actually a fairly sizable reduction in unemployment that is not to be sniffed at. Typically, we get politicians in a panic if the unemployment rate rises by 0.7, and in this case, it fell by 0.7. The number seems small, but it's actually not.
And what do you think? Why do you think the carbon tax in that particular jurisdiction perhaps helped employment?
Well, essentially, they used it for two things, right? One is to reduce labor taxes, so that just makes labor more attractive. You just want to hire more people, and part of it, as Casey said in the chat, was used to support low-income earners. And one positive thing about sending checks in the post, even if they're tiny checks, Casey, to people on low incomes, is that most of that money is immediately spent in the economy. So you have an immediate demand effect, and that stimulates the economy and therefore leads to more employment.
Thank you. I think the next question we'll go on to is one about China, and I think broader competitiveness issues. We see that there's clearly a much greater demand from politicians in Western countries to tax carbon and to embark on sort of carbon mitigation policies more generally. And China, you could say, was sort of cynically playing along with this, but all the meanwhile becoming relatively much more competitive compared to the West. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you think are China's real intentions, and do you see that competitiveness gap growing in the future? Ross.
I don't claim to understand China very much, and in fact, the few books I've read on the subject always caution outsiders that unless you are very fluent in the language, it's extremely difficult to get any real insight into the thinking of the government of China. I don't really believe that they are making any kind of green transition. I think they're very good at presenting an image to the West that serves their interest, and it's in their interest that we should continue to burden ourselves with policies that restrict our energy consumption and make our industries uncompetitive. And one of the things that, if we're going to take them at their word, they do have a long-standing goal that by 2049, which is the 100th-year anniversary of the Maoist revolution, they want to be the dominant economy in the world. And I think it's this odd coincidence that, so as of 2050, they want to be the dominant economy in the world, and we are saying that as of 2050, we want to achieve net zero emissions, which, from everything that we've discussed today, would be, under present technology at least, it would be ruinous. And so we are on, in the West versus China, we're on two extremely different trajectories. And I would find it just completely implausible to think that with everything they're actually doing, that China secretly has some ambition to impose net zero type outcomes on themselves and become the kind of green utopia that, for instance, the UK seems to want to become. And so with the enormous caveat that I know very little about China, and what little I know just tells me that it's an extremely difficult political entity to understand. From everything I see, I think we are on two very different trajectories, and the Chinese probably view it at this point as very advantageous for themselves, that we continue on our green trajectory and they continue on their 2049 trajectory.
Thank you. And Richard, I wonder what your reaction has been to the recent net zero so-called announcement from the Chinese government. Could you just explain to everyone what that actually involves and how credible you think that is?
Well, like Ross, I'm not a great China expert. The impression that I always get from China is that nobody is a great China expert, including people in China itself. And that even though we sort of from the outside view China as a monolith where a strongman is in charge, I don't think that is actually true. That is true in certain parts of the polity, but there's a lot of things going on in China that are completely out of Xi Jinping's control. Now, that particular target that you're talking about, that is just not credible, I think, because zero emissions by at least 2050 or so, what they announced, or maybe 2060, would require prematurely retiring some of the gleaming new coal-fired power plants that they built. And the capital destruction of that would be so large that I don't think they're going to do that. That said, China has a history of destroying its own capital, so maybe they will. Hard to say. There are a couple of things that I think we can say about China, and one thing that they definitely do not like is the fact that they have to import so much oil and so much gas. And that can explain why they are so active in developing alternatives for oil and gas. They're also very active in alternatives for coal-fired electricity. And that is partly inspired by air pollution and partly inspired by the fact that they spot an export market. And that has domestic ramifications as well. At the moment, if my Chinese friends are correct, it is cheaper to make electricity in China with solar power than with coal. And the only reason that the Chinese government continues to support coal and permit new coal-fired power plants is because the coal lobby is so strong. But regardless of how authoritarian a government is, you cannot keep on backing a losing horse. And at the moment, coal is losing to solar also in China. So that would suggest that they're going to also their electricity sector within the next 10 years or so, all new builds will be carbon free simply because it's cheaper to be carbon free already now, let alone in 10 years time with prices falling. So I think that they will indeed at one point start cutting emissions quite severely, but probably not fast enough to meet the target that was just announced. That seems to be for global consumption rather than a real domestic target.
Thank you, Richard. We're sort of coming to the end of our time now, so I'd like to sort of shoehorn in two final questions. One of them was from Joe Oliver. He asked about the potential of a UK trading scheme, emissions trading scheme. We've touched on it slightly, but I'd be interested to get both of your thoughts about the comparison between emissions trading scheme and setting just a single carbon price. And also we had a comment from Jeremy Nicholson, who suggested that actually the UK was a good example of where a carbon price has actually delivered a significant emissions reduction very cheaply in sort of enforcing coal to gas switching. And that had delivered a very strong reduction in CO2 emissions at a good price. And what you see is the sort of prospects for potentially further coal to gas switching in the rest of the world. Russ.
Well, on the first point, if I take your point, comparing emission trading systems versus a carbon tax, and just I commented on that earlier, that for reasons related to where all the volatility emerges in the market, emission trading systems generally are unpopular unless you have a backstop price in place, and then eventually the tradable permit system just becomes a carbon tax in that setup. As far as coal to gas switching in the UK, I guess Richard should really comment on it. I thought that happened back during the Thatcher years and the dash to gas. It has happened in North America because of the fracking revolution, and the price of natural gas went down quite a bit, and a lot of coal-fired power plants just converted over, partly because of stricter air pollution regulations, but also the drop in the price of the fuel. But bear in mind that those, if you're just relying on the accident of the gas price going down, the gas price might go up, and so you could get a switch back to coal if that made sense economically. But I'd like to hear Richard's thoughts on whether there's continued scope in the UK, for instance, for expanding natural gas, because I thought that was more of a declining sector in the UK as well.
Shall I take the last one first? The jury is still out what caused the last, Ross is right that there was actually in the 80s and the 90s a dash for gas, right, which was essentially Nigel Lawson's doing, right, with the breaking of the coal unions. And that was Thatcher, and the liberalization of the electricity market, which was Nigel's doing. But we have seen a more recent switch from coal to gas as well, and the jury is out what was the cause of that. A lot of people seem to say, well, this is climate policy, and this is the carbon tax and the EU ETS, that the price that was imposed on the coal industry. But in the background, we of course also had acid rain policy that essentially made coal a lot more expensive than it used to be. And what we see is that the last coal-fired power plants ran out just as the derogations, the final derogations under acid rain policy ran out. And I think that the latter is actually more important, the more important reason why those coal-fired power plants closed. The reason that no new ones have been built may have to do with climate policy and the expectation of future more stringent climate policy. It also has to do with the fact that the regulatory regime in electricity is so chaotic in the UK, with policies changing sometimes on a daily basis, that you would be fairly crazy to commit to something that is as big and as long-lasting and as inflexible as a coal-fired power plant. And of course, we've seen more and more wind and solar come online. And that means that you need power plants that can flexibly complement those things. And again, a coal-fired power plant is simply the wrong choice. So it's a mix of reasons, but the final culprit who really did it is still unknown. But I'm pretty sure it wasn't just climate policy that did it. Now the question about should the UK have UK ETS or not? Everything here is up in the air. The vandals in government have essentially destroyed current UK climate policy without replacement. It would be easy to have a UK ETS because that would just be a carbon copy of the EU ETS. All the regulations are in place, all the monitoring, all the enforcement is in place, so it is very easy to do. That said, a UK ETS would not make a lot of sense unless it is coupled one-on-one with the EU ETS. The UK is simply too small to have much gains from trade internally. So that would then suggest that, yeah, it would probably be better to replace it with a carbon tax. And that seems to be the plan at the moment. Although I've been following it on and off, it's particularly unclear what they really plan to do come January 1st, which, as we know, is almost 6 years away, right? So we have plenty of time to think about what we're going to do between now and New Year.
Right. I think we might have just about time to fit in one more question, which is about this sort of egalitarian impact of these policies. Are the poor globally, I'm thinking particularly about, and if you impose, let's say, theoretically a carbon tax globally, would this have a sort of deleterious effect on the poor of the world who haven't industrialized yet, perhaps, and need to go through much dirtier forms of economic development before they can kind of be in the same situation as we are in terms of reducing our emissions? And so we've talked about border carbon tax adjustments. Is this not something that would really hit poor countries in an unfair way? Ross, would you like to comment on that?
Within a single country, it is important to recognize that energy costs are a declining fraction of your household budget as your income goes up. So there is always a potential for regressive policies when you make energy more expensive, unless there's some offsetting mechanism elsewhere in public policy to deal with that. Internationally, yeah, I'm very concerned about this egalitarian issue on two grounds. First of all, even if it were the case that current power plants were no cleaner than they were in the 1950s, it's still the case that developing countries are entitled to develop. And I don't like this attitude of Westerners pulling up the drawbridge and saying, well, we don't like the environmental consequences of you guys reach our standard of living, so we're going to cut off your access to investment capital and thwart it from happening, so you don't get the electricity system that you need. Electricity really is the driver of development. It's the engine of growth for people, and it's important that we allow that to be a priority for developing countries. But the technology is way different now. We're not proposing to build the kind of old, smoky, poorly built coal-fired power plants that Europe and North America had 100 years ago. Even if it's going to be a coal-fired power plant, it's probably going to be a supercritical power plant that has scrubbers on the smokestacks and meets very high standards for environmental performance. And then there are other alternatives, including gas and so forth. So they're leapfrogging a stage of development, essentially. They're already able to build up to standards where they don't have to invent the technology, and they have access to the technology at a low cost. So I'm very concerned about decisions by some of the international lending agencies that are just saying no to coal no matter where, and they're essentially throwing up extreme roadblocks for developing countries to try to build their electricity grid and achieve the standard of living that they're entitled to achieve.
Thank you. And Richard?
Yeah, two things about the distributional consequences within countries. The good thing about a carbon tax is that you have tax revenue. And there's by now a number of studies that show that if you just devote 1/3 of that carbon tax revenue to supporting low-income households, you actually offset, or sometimes more than offset, the negative consequences of a carbon tax, the regressive consequences of a carbon tax. I completely agree with Ross that we should not be imposing our policies on other countries. And that includes, of course, imposing our views about climate policy on less developed countries. I think that is just morally wrong, and they should find their own development path and their own the role of energy in that. And the policy of the World Bank and other multilateral organizations to stop supporting coal, I think, is a bad decision. Because clean energy and cheap energy, or cheap energy, is a greater good than climate change is a bad, I believe. But at the same time, of course, solar power and wind power are becoming so cheap that you should wonder the wisdom, you should wonder about the wisdom of building new coal. But it should definitely not be us imposing this on them. And what we've seen across the world is that reliable electricity and cheap electricity is very, very important for economic development.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just a comment from me before we close. We've had a few questions about sort of how much carbon dioxide is really is a negative effect, and what the social cost of carbon is, for example, which we did touch on. But I was determined that rather than a discussion of how bad or not climate change is, that this was a discussion more about carbon taxes as a policy. And I appreciate that some people will have been keen to talk about that a bit more, but I hope they'll be able to understand why we've stuck more to the policy conversation around carbon taxes and the various areas that we've discussed. So I'd like to thank Professor Richard Toll and Professor Ross McKittrick for joining us. I think they've added so many useful comments there, and I'm sure you will have all have plenty to think about having heard them, and of course to Victoria Hewson as well, who had to leave us earlier. Now we've got a date for your diary, which you might want to take down before I say goodbye, which is the 24th of November, so next Tuesday, in just a week's time. We're going to be having a webinar jointly with the Australian Environment Foundation, and that's going to include Dr. Peter Ridd, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, who's been looking at coral reefs, and Joanna Nova as well, who's given a talk to us before actually about the Australian electricity system and blackouts in South Australia. And that's going to be on the checks and balance within the scientific method and how we can ensure the credibility of scientific research. So keep that date in mind. It's going to be in Australia, so that will be in the morning here, and please look out for an email that will be going out about that very shortly. So thank you very much all for joining us. It's been another excellent webinar, and we thank our panelists, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you all soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.